We're very pleased to speak here this evening in the context of the Barnard Lecture, and our appreciation also extends to the Thornburg Foundation for its actually courageous, I think, celebration of innovative architecture. We're also, I think, especially auspicious to be speaking here in the context of this building, the School of Architecture, where for us, I think, the invitation to see and be seen is so beautifully foregrounded in the dramatic section. It's a very generous building, and I think both Mary and I teach, and it's the kind of building I suspect one would love teaching in and one would love learning about architecture in. The territories of architecture, landscape, urban design, and planning are increasingly fluid, and the dynamic zone between these territories has been both the site and the inspiration for the trajectory of the work we've been doing over the past several years. The increasingly transparent sort of film between design disciplines and the imperative to operate at multiple scales touches on preoccupations that have become increasingly relevant to the work which we'll present tonight. For us, the territory of architecture should concern itself with the whole of the built environment, heighten disciplinary distinctions, architecture, or landscape, or civil engineering, or planning, marginalize the status of an architectural project, and diminish the capacity to create supple, multivalent public settings. Today, architects, and indeed all designers, landscape architects, planners, must work of necessity in a hybrid terrain, no longer just adding to a site or on a site, but rather transforming from a site, adding new dimensions to the previous traces of human inhabitation. In other words, sites are given, not made, and through this process, the authentic can emerge.
So I think, as Michael has said, for us it's a huge privilege to be here this evening, and we're really grateful, Roger, for your invitation here, and Dean Forbes for your welcoming here, and also Antoine, congratulations on allowing us to be speaking in your amazing hall here. Congratulations, amazing. I think, as Michael has touched on some of our preoccupations, we found ourselves operating in the sort of interstices between a set of disciplines that you all, I think, get to experience at the interstices here. When we had a tour, we saw that architecture, landscape, planning, undergraduate, graduate, no physical boundaries here in the studios. You are proximate and engaging in a kind of peripheral experience. But what we found is that when we began our adventure into architecture, these disciplinary boundaries were problematic, and people wanted to cast your lot in one place, but not the other. So we felt that our projects, and the projects you'll see today, this evening, are projects that find themselves actually energized by the interstices between these disciplines. And in fact, one could say over the past decade, we have been finding that the emerging strands between all these disciplines have some challenge, but some opportunity that has yet to be mined. So our practice then is really this kind of a sectional cross through the disciplines, and in a sense, a more synthetic expression between the boundaries between art, architecture, ecology, infrastructure, and the either-or, in a sense, has no resonance to our practice. So if we think about this more expansive, generous, open-ended, uncertain definition of what architecture could be, we find ourselves drawn to projects that are, by their very nature, uncertain. And that's why competitions have been such a great, compelling place for us to work, because those usually are about questions that are far larger.
So we'll start with a series of images that had sort of inspired our work, and together they radically offer different interpretations for constructing a site. We love the juxtaposition here of a chameleon in Costa Rica, which disturbs the conventions of figure and ground, what sort of recedes, what advances. And similarly, although a slightly disturbing image of a military installation in Pisco Valley here in New Mexico, it's both disturbing but quite beautiful in the sense that the kind of topography emerges from a kind of neutral ground plane. Similarly, we're interested in the pairing of these two slides. It's interesting that culture and cultivation share the same root. In the image on the left, you'll see Hunan, China, where terracing the land to capture water and grow rice is an imperative. Similarly, in a very different kind of vein, the Spanish Steppes, a sort of beautiful masterwork by Despecchi, is about topography and movement. It could be seen as an infrastructural project. It could be seen as an architectural project. It could also be seen as a landscape project. Similarly, Le Corbusier's prescient and beautiful merging of highway, housing, and horizon suggests a more hybrid approach. When we think about materiality, this kind of chameleon-like approach, this sort of hybrid sense of how materials might be rendered, in a way allows us to be drawn to so we're in these two images, we're drawn on the left, you might recognize Bernini's quite extraordinary Agony of St. Teresa, where stone, a hard material, is rendered soft and pliable, while in Dan Flavin's work, light, that most sort of effervescent of materials, is thick, viscous, almost palpable. You can almost touch it. And we love this kind of reversal, both of materials and of disciplinary thinking. So I'd like to start with a project that was initiated about 12 years ago that we've kind of come back to. This is a Museum of the Earth in Ithaca, which expands for us the territory of architecture in a way by reshaping the whole site. If you're familiar with the Finger Lakes region of New York, you kind of understand the sort of incredible sense of geology, the way water has shaped the whole environment, and in a way, the sense that this is still very much a living environment, which was inspirational to our work. And here the kind of geology of the Finger Lakes is sort of driven by a series of ravines that are almost sort of a 90-degree angle to, in this case, Lake Cayuga. And you see the little sort of dot there, and these lines that are kind of inscribed on the surface of the topography become areas where water emerges and is sort of driven to the lake by the sort of natural geometry of the substructure of the kind of geology of the region. So the idea was to take a museum, and rather than define it as a single building, rather it becomes a sort of a gorge in a way. One of the sort of builds on the sort of metaphor of the gorge of the region, so that the kind of landscape is given precedent over the architecture. And here you can start to see, rather than just a single building, it was an opportunity to reshape a site, to kind of think about the nuances of the topography, make that topography vivid in the context of resolving what was an enormous parking lot. So the parking requirements became a series of opportunities to introduce water terraces that would collect water, filter it through a series of basins, and then finally allow the water to be discharged in Lake Cayuga in a clean state. Well, the museum becomes a sort of Guggenheim in reverse, where you enter at a high point and then kind of descend into the earth, in a way discovering the sense of geologic time. And it's an idea, and I think this is a school of architecture, so Mary and I want to talk a little bit about how we work, which is rather broad, and we try to use as many media as possible. But these drawings that Mary and I have done, in a way, start to reflect a way of discovering a project. And in this case, rather than a black box museum, it was an attempt to sort of open the box up to its environment so that you could understand the role and the nexus of geology and biology that is, in a way, how the earth has been shaped. Central to the project has also been the kind of redefinition of the ground plane, and we include these working drawings because often architects, I think, are mute to the idea that topography is a kind of a plastic, and not in material, but a kind of plastic and spatial construct. And the idea of extending a kind of architecture into the landscape was central to this project and to a number of projects that followed. So here you can start to see the kind of shaping of the terrain, the use of a sort of locally quarried stone that, by the way, has a series of fossils embedded in it, so that the sort of pedagogy of walking to the museum from your car is evident. This stone actually was part of the Devonian Ocean, which blanketed most of upstate New York. So the two buildings are sort of partially buried and connected below grade, and they kind of identify a sort of trajectory into the ground, or alternately a trajectory of emerging from the ground. So that emerging, are you, okay. So here you see that sort of sense of perspectival convergence that the kind of museum wing gives you as you sort of emerge from the topography. As I mentioned, you can kind of work your way down into the museum, and you see on the image on the right, you ascend, and there's a kind of right whale, the skeleton of a right whale, which in a way marks the kind of current condition, the sort of current sense of the kind of anthropology and biology of our time, in a way. And then finally you descend down deep into the lower parts of the building. You're confronted with this sort of black stone, which is a Devonian stone, millions and millions of years old. And you can start to appreciate in that stone the kind of sense of a kind of skeletal formation that's very, very evident in the beautiful skeleton of the right whale. You can start to see the kind of sense that the building is partially submerged, and a sense that you kind of, as you discover your way back in time, you're always confronted with the present reality. Okay, the next slide. And likewise, the two buildings kind of, in a way, define a space where the sort of roughness of the concrete is not only a sort of metaphor, but becomes a sort of teaching device for the kind of formation of limestone and a number of the different kinds of sedimentary stones that are found in upstate New York. So we collect water, carry it into a glacial garden that freezes in the winter and becomes a sort of palpable way of understanding the continuing power of water. And that water is collected, as I mentioned, becomes cleansed, and it too then, next please, is finally dropped into a kind of a naturally constructed detention basin. And here, some 10 years later, is a sort of emerging sense of nature taking over. And there are probably almost 400 different species that have emerged over the last 10 years.
And so as Michael's been talking about this particular project, the sense of movement, water, and passage, which so defined the territory of PRI and earthwork, was something that actually took a different take altogether at Smith College Campus Center. And I think I'll go with Michael's next instead of experimenting with the very ambitious answer here. But some of you may know Smith College, but it's in Northampton, Massachusetts. It's a fabulous college, a small college, women's college. And it has architecture that's defined by brick, gravity-bound administrative buildings and academic buildings, and then wood residential buildings. The campus, though, is maybe less remarkable for architecture, but very remarkable for landscape. And that landscape by Olmsted was something that defined for us, when we thought about a campus center, a new kind of center. And as we looked at this campus, where all the dialogue seemed to happen en route on the campus paths, we wondered whether we could postpone the idea of architecture long enough to see what it might mean to actually have an inhabitable network of paths as a center. So we postponed by doing drawings, looking at the views that we thought were so wonderful, and what they might be as we were on a covered walk looking out. Next. And then we also realized that it was a very odd place, a kind of parking lot that had one face, which where the narrow end of the building is an historic street with small buildings. And then the other side, the academic side, was something that was more generous. So the building really slaloms from something that needs to be petite to meet the historic review process, and then generous and welcoming on the academic side. So this really was a bit of a chameleon. Michael shared the chameleon in those early slides. The building had to be modest and sort of wood, wood residential construction. And I think the microphone is also a little idiosyncratic here. But this sectional chameleon was one that moved all the way to the generosity of the campus and extended to lawn, to a new Chapin lawn, if you will, for commencement and gatherings. Next. But there it is, the year-and-a-half process, 18 months to get this building approved for this one facade by the state of Massachusetts to look as diminutive as the other residential buildings, which was very important. But the other side starts to change as it comes around to the academic edge. The white painted wood opens up, next, into something that's really a much more transparent and welcoming glass building that faces the campus and opens in all directions to invite people in, next. And that invitation is one where our fantasy of this kind of inhabitable, multi-leveled Olmstedian path would also allow this idea of peripheral vision and cross views down, across, and over, would give you a sense, in many ways like this building does, that something's happening and that you can't miss what's happening because you're part of it when you're just walking through the building. Next. And so you could say that the kind of roofs, liners, and edges allowed us to do this kind of wandering, synthetically shifting building next. Where, in fact, the tactility of the wood structures that we were inspired by in the historic neighborhood could actually translate into something different. And that the Botanic Garden, which was at the heart of the campus, might be found again inside the campus center. And so we actually took photographs of the Botanic Garden, enlarged them, and cast them in resin to make all the cafe tables that distributed themselves along that gallery walk. Next. And so that when one is in the building, it's about looking across and through, and you can even see on this lower level here that there's always a sense of light. Next. Light because we carved away the topography on the one side that would have been a basement to bring a kind of variety slope down to get barred light inside, get the barred, sliver views across this slender walk. Next. But a more generous, if you will, frontage to the Chapin lawn. Next. So that finally, this is the only building that's open 24 hours during finals. That sense of welcome would be something that would be apparent 24 hours a day, all seasons, and be in many ways a kind of translation of the generosity of the greenhouses and the openness of the Olmstedian landscape. So this query of what landscape can do and how it can actually make connections maybe that could not be made through architecture alone really came into focus at the International Retreat. And as we can tell you this, it's somewhere in the Northeast on 460 acres, and you won't find it on Google. And there are some folks there who had meetings that you could say, like Camp David, that are meetings that you will not find out about. But on this incredible bucolic landscape, next, there were a series of buildings, a stable, a boarding house, and a garage that were on the grounds, but not connected in any compelling way. And this was to be transformed into an international retreat. So our query was, how could we make landscape the intersection that might link all these disparate buildings together in a new way? So you could imagine the boarding house, not that distinguished, but reasonably distinguished. We felt that if we could carve away at it strategically and bring light into it, that we could transform this, collect water, and bring a new landscape into what a retreat might be. Yeah? So a garage would be a new home then for ambassadors in critical meetings. Next. So Kofi Annan could actually have and host a meeting here with voice lift and all the sophisticated things that are required, but still use an old structure in a new way. Next. But that the new place, if you will, in the boarding house now is a greenhouse. And that greenhouse, next, is one where we actually felt that while the meetings, which happen with some regularity when the weather is not so compelling, that there should be a garden that people could sit in and look out. And as you could look at this, see the edge of the rug there. That's a 70-foot hand-woven rug inspired by the lawns that are mowed and the grasses that are mowed, so that this transition between inside and outside would be fairly inevitable. And that landscape, if you will, what used to be the back area where the cars would drop off, became something altogether new, where the water collection system on the grounds is seen here and hosted. And in fact, that connective tissue, if you will, of this landscape and the greenhouse are really ultimately a place where we expect the offhand encounters to be far more maybe interesting than the very structured ones in the conference rooms inside. So Barnard College Diana Center, here was a competition that we wanted to win so much because it was a library, and we believe deeply in libraries. And this was a strange adventure where what was a library became an art, architecture, drama, theater, and mixed-use building. And that transformation was remarkable. If you go to the next slide. This was an amazing situation. Barnard, which you know is sort of linked at the hip, if you will, to Columbia University, but has its own autonomy across the street on Broadway, is this wonderful hidden campus, if you will. It's an oasis. So if you see these two landscapes, one above the compelling Lehman Lawn, one below Millbank Courtyard, these were two separated landscapes that form this tiny 4-acre campus. Next. And so we started to think about what might this building do. We thought that first we would try to rebuild the campus that had been divided in the 1960s by Millbank, the building to be torn down and replaced, that created great separation between these two landscapes and the intellectual landscape on the rooftop of the original older building in the greenhouse. So we said that maybe we could do better if we're going to create a new face to the campus. This is the building that, of course, in the 60s, when you're doing the building for a women's college, you want to make sure that the city never gets in and the women never get out. So what we started to think about was, how do we actually connect this landscape together? Because it had been divided by a 15-foot wall inside the campus. And then we thought, how could we actually allow all the kinds of diverse programs that started to emerge over the course of working with our client, like theater, like architecture, like the library, but all these components, if they were to be seen across and through the building, that we could actually take the geographic separation that tall buildings have and create something new. So landscape was invoked, and the idea of these kind of connected landscapes, indoor and out, led the thread of thinking about how this 100,000 square foot building might be shaped. So again, postponing conclusions for a while to think about the essence of the conceptual armature. Next. So you can see here, this was Millbank as we saw it. Rather formidable. Next. And what we wanted to do was to look at Barnard's extraordinary programs and make them literally a kind of diorama of activities and inquiry, if you will, that might provoke the imagination of people on the street, but also convey to the rest of New York what Barnard was up to. So this was that barrier, that wall that separated those two landscapes. And this was what we felt was fundamental and needed to be transformed. And you couldn't see across the campus, but if we go to the next slide, we actually tore down that wall, in fact tore out the bowling alley below, and carried this extended ascending amphitheater of a landscape so that these two separate parts of the campus could now become one. We also, if you go back just one slide, we also then felt that unlike some of the more generous campuses that we've seen with all the crisscrossing lawns that you see on the grounds of Harvard and Cornell, that with less real estate, those crisscrossing walks need to make a vertical sort of expression. So as our client said, this is the world's most expensive fire stair. It's true, it's significantly less efficient than a straight shot, but this allows you to have views across and through the campus as you connect through the building. And so this diagram, if you will, of delayed movement but with views, combined with ascending views inside, next, was this kind of, if you will, a sort of riff of the solidity of glass, if you will, and the transparency of it being fully evident on the campus side, next. That movement to and through was offering up an experience that was collaborating with the kind of programmatic agendas inside, next. And so programmatically inside, of course, the multi-use space, wood-lined, a kind of violin is at the base, anchoring the space. But when one comes upstairs to the cafe, Then the views cast all the way through to the final top next of the gallery architecture critique space. And of course, you know where our heart lies. That is the architecture studio and gallery critique. We're looking down from there now at the library space, the dining areas, the cafe, and out to Broadway. But it really is about this kind of ambition, if you will, in an academic setting, that if you can't see and you're not seen, then you're not part of this community. And so it really was about transforming what we see for that community.
If you could back up just a second. But I think the idea of glass, and I think it's a myth that glass is transparent. Glass is this extraordinary material that is alternately translucent, at times transparent, and at times completely reflected. But we love the idea that the surfaces of the building can talk about not only the sort of interior programs, the interior uses, but also kind of oscillate and begin to accommodate a series of exterior programs. So the sort of facades always have this kind of oscillation between inside and outside. Next, please. And I think as, in a way, as this award, so I think powerfully celebrates the idea that architecture is, as Antoine mentioned, living, so too were we confronted with the challenge and the opportunity of building in a historic brick-lined campus. And we were intrigued, if you could back up, please, with the idea that glass could become a kind of collaborator. The kind of chroma of glass might recall the brick without necessarily mimicking it. So we were intrigued with the materiality of glass and its changeability. Next, please. And the sense that the kind of glass could negotiate a very, very deep section, find its way into the kind of core of the building and then back out and qualify and temper light as it sort of operated. Next, please. And that led to a series of full-scale experiments. The glass is kind of fantastic acid-etched, color integral, translucent, and at times fritted material that in a way gets its sort of power and drama by being a material that lets light through, and then that light in turn bounces back depending on the kind of back pan, which is a sort of material that's in this case, 5.5 inches behind the glass. So on the right you see the glass without any colored back pan, and then on the far left you see it with a sort of bright orange back pan. So we're testing out the different qualities of color, and the ability, which we found out rather sort of serendipitously, is that the kind of magic for us was when the building would start to shift chroma and be somewhat unpredictable in its color. Next, please. And all of this, in a way, was, and I think we would argue, for the pleasure and the surprise of accidents. In this case, the kind of grain of the paper, the charcoal, led us to experiment next with the idea of fritting that somehow would capture this rather diaphanous sense of whether color is there or whether it isn't. And likewise, next please, you can start to see how the glass changes from a sort of orange to a deep, deep, almost bronze color. Then plays with and collaborates with its brick neighbors. Next. And at times collaborates with the sky so that glass actually shifts from a kind of bronze to an almost pewter-like silver. And then finally at night, when the kind of quality of light drops, the sort of reverse happens. The stare that Marion talked about, the kind of figural stare, becomes the kind of predominant element. And here you see our privileging the architecture thesis studio up at the very top. So I think students can't possibly make bad architecture with a view of the city. And you can start to see the sense of the building being a collaborator with its neighbors, having a kind of identity, but still understanding that it's part of a larger conversation. So the wall as it was, And then hopefully this sort of diaphanous veil on Broadway, the building as it is now. This next project for the Brooklyn Botanic Garden is very much a work in progress. You'll see it's nearly complete, hopefully in about 2 months it'll be finished. But it's a visitor center for a rather beautiful botanic garden in Brooklyn, in the heart of the city. And it's Janus-like in its setting. On one hand, it faces a rather bleak parking lot, but once inside the garden, you're exposed to this sort of magical collection. In a way, a botanic garden is a special kind of museum, a museum that's both fragile and ephemeral. So you can start to see our interest in actually developing the site that would sort of pick up these two extremes and act in a way less as a sort of object building, but more as a sort of sieve, as a kind of transitional threshold building. A threshold between city, next, identified in the kind of gray and green origami, the sort of city and garden, where the building would gently transition and carry you and seduce you in a way into the garden. Next. So you see the kind of diagram where the building follows the contours of an existing berm, in a way accentuates them. I think one of the great lessons from the landscape architect Olmsted, the sense that the building always unfolds. You see this in this kind of early sketch. The sort of energy of the garden is embedded in the building itself. Next. And it's given a kind of three-dimensional characteristic. So as I mentioned, it becomes a kind of inhabitable topography. Next. Seen in a way cinematically, so that the kind of structure itself, the kind of moment frames of these kind of continuous steel structural skeletons always warp, twist, both in plan and in section. Next. And in a way start at the bottom with a sort of assertive presence on the city, and then slowly melt into the landscape, and the building almost completely disappears into the existing and slightly reconfigured topography on the upper left. You can see a study model where we're looking at kind of inserting this into the berm, twisting, slowly revealing in a kind of episodic way the landscapes of the garden. Next. So you enter from the city. Next. You can start to see this is taken maybe about 3 weeks ago. The kind of skylight slowly starts to suggest that their building is a kind of porous threshold. Next. And then in the building, you start to see this kind of, it acts as a sort of frame to the garden. Next. You can start to see that slowly twisting with this kind of idea of a sort of Olmstedian path as a generator. Glass alternately reflects the garden, but also offers dappled light. And it's a building that you assert your way through, sort of find your way through from two sides. On the upper level, which you see here. Next, please. It allows you to kind of slide through the building from both sides. Next. And then finally, you can start to see how it at times almost disappears into the topography of this rather dramatic site. Next. On the garden side, it becomes a very, very pronounced kind of greenhouse.
And as Michael's talked about the pronounced greenhouse, we discovered something greener than you could ever imagine in South Korea. We were very honored to be invited to international competition to design the Taekwondo Park. And so we were obviously thrilled to win, because Taekwondo, as we learned, and Muju, South Korea, as we learned, have a very interesting resonance. Taekwondo is not just a martial art, but it's a way of life. It's a body, mind, and spirit discipline. And Muju, South Korea, which is actually, some people might know, a great ski resort, is an incredible place of nature that you have never seen before. And the greenhouse effect, if you will, is actually the ginseng plastic covering over the landscape, cultivating things in really amazing ways. But what was unique to this site and to this query of creating a new center for Taekwondo was, for us, how could we find some programmatic resonance with this incredibly topographically vivid site? And what we did is we looked at it as on the right-hand side, the master plan stated, if you will, originally for all the competitors, that all the competition program elements, from the arena to the school to the training center and the spa, needed to be in the valley because that was where they could build the most easily. We looked at the course of the water that made its way through these mountains and valleys and felt that that was the very place we would not build. Next. And as we started to study the kind of ways that people cultivated the land and did build on the land, operating in parallel on contours seemed so much more brilliant than building in the valley. And so we started to trace those contours, next, as a kind of territory by which we could actually organize the site into zones of body, mind, and spirit. So you could see the body, if you will, with the world international competitions in the arena, the school, the next level up, and of course the spirit, which you would imagine at the top of the hill. But this is really the kind of programmatic organization that I described. It was one that really needed to actually still host these events, but in our mind, find the there there and allow the other theirs to emerge through a wandering passage. And that passage, if you will, could cross the water and cross that valley, bless you, so that with every ascending moment where there's large crowds through the big bridge that needed to take trucks, or the very delicate bridge at the very top near the place of reflection, that one would always be aware of this nature, crossing it and engaging it, and ascending, if you will, to different levels. Next. And so we wanted water to be present and invoked in this experience so that it might be gathered in ceremonial ways at the reflecting pool where the arena is, but it could just find itself as a wandering stream in the water terraces up near the top. Next. So then this issue of cultivation, postponing architecture but amplifying the idea of cultivation, allowed us to give some structure to these hillsides, prevent erosion, and develop a planting program that actually would work with the agricultural metaphor of the area. And then next, start to create a place that could frame up places for the competition. And this is Celadon glass. Celadon glaze is one of the most extraordinary of the Korean arts. And so inspired by that, the arena takes that. Next. And that the school and the training center is one that hugs the next round of valleys that work across there. And the training fields, if you will, are ascended terraces. Next. So that those very training events are part of what you see when you're at the school. And that this is a place that next has to be extraordinary in the winter because this is a great winter destination as well. So those rooftops become cross-country routes. Next. But, of course, the most important place is the Olympic-sized pool in the wintertime. So this really becomes a kind of metaphor operating within the contours of this extraordinary site. Next. And that operation makes its way all the way up to the water terraces and the spa. Next. So that the water collection at the very top is carried in here, filtered, paused, and detention or retention are carried through the kind of wetland and terrace landscape. But you can see these bridges becoming very, very delicate and fragile as they cross the ravine. Next. And that is indeed part of the ascent of Taekwondo, that the higher you go, the more difficult and more fragile it is to stay at the top. So ultimately, what we're most excited about is with this really wild adventure, if you will, of getting to know a culture that we never knew and appreciating things that we had so much to learn about. Next. It is under construction, and that group you see on the right is a group of Taekwondo fans coming to see the future of the Taekwondo Center with, as you can imagine on the right, all the erosion control mats in place. So next, Michael's going to talk about another place where water has much more to play.
So the next two projects are very much at the intersection of architecture, landscape, and ecology, and I think they suggest the need for us as a discipline to rethink how we approach architecture and infrastructure and landscape, particularly as we face increasingly extremes of climate. So this is Toronto. This was a competition we didn't win, so I think in many ways somehow, and I'm sure Antoine would agree, sometimes painful as it is, you do learn in many ways from every effort. But this was an important project for us, and it turned out for the city of Toronto in terms of how to frame this discussion. But here is the Lower Don River, and the competition brief asked the designers, the finalists, to really rethink this narrow strip of water that in a way was the terminus of this extraordinary watershed. Next, please. And this extraordinary watershed was sort of actually one of the great bird sanctuaries at the turn of the century. And increasingly, because it's been dammed and armored, there is a very real chance that there'll be a major flood again. And the rates of flooding have increased dramatically in the last 10 years. So imagine this enormous, about 400 square miles of watershed descending into this armored channel, which at the time, probably in the 30s and 40s, was seen as the apogee of what industrial and civil engineering should do. Rather, we thought that by working with a series of hydrologists, we might suggest an alternative, a kind of soft infrastructure that would harness the hydrology and the realities of hydrology into a more supple and perhaps more interesting kind of environment. So you see the kind of series of arcs and curves which are driven by the logic of hydrology are sort of given, in a way, new presence and celebrated into a series of different environments where flooding, rather than being fought with armored edges, is allowed to, in a way, shape environments that are a little bit more porous and more sponge-like and more fluid. You can see its relationship to Toronto, which is quite extraordinary. It sort of becomes alternately a backdrop and a forecourt to the city. Next, please. And in so doing, it gave us a chance to kind of rethink the sort of heroic Piranesian engineering of the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, and to try, next please, to reclaim that and in a way to reframe it so that the best of that kind of engineering could be appreciated, yet understanding that the forces of nature can't be fought with brute force. So here you see the industrial landscape as it was, as we propose it, a sort of soft, marshy, in a way, sort of atmospheric sense that the sort of temporality of water could be, in fact, be something beautiful and shape an environment. The major flooding is channeled into this large canal that exists. Next, please. And here we're actually looking at shaping that so that playing fields can accommodate flooding when it does occur and then return to a kind of dry state. So the temporality and the sort of ephemeral qualities are rather incorporated in design rather than resisted. Next. So finally, the idea of reframing with a new kind of landscape, a new kind of infrastructure, next, is what we were hoping to achieve in this park. Next project is in St. Louis. And St. Louis, too, as you know, is prone to increasing cycles of flooding. Next, please. And it's an extraordinary city, really, in a way, at the sort of belly button of this enormous, one of the kind of great rivers of the world, the Mississippi watershed. Next. And you kind of zoom in, and you can start to understand the power of the river and its ability to change over the course of time. Every 50 years, every 100 years, a sort of major realignment of the Mississippi registers itself in the topography. And yet St. Louis operates, it's both sort of threatened by the river, but obviously its lifeblood came from the river. Unfortunately, that lifeblood also suggested that with train lines and highways, the beauty of the river was choked off from the city. And you can start to see the incredible park, Sarenen's great park and Dan Kiley's extraordinary landscape, exists as a sort of island that's been bifurcated on virtually every side. So one of the challenges of this competition was not only to sort of harness the beauty and ephemeral quality of the river, but also overcome the sort of barriers that separated this great site from the city. Next. And so you can start to see the waterfront is alternately accessible and inaccessible given the increasingly high and dramatic changes of water level. Next. And out of that became a kind of, we started to think about, as with Toronto, the kind of hydrology, the rather beautiful hydrology of the river and how that might suggest a new paradigm for operating at the water's edge. The idea that we could create one district rather than a park only on one side, but one park that recognized that a river has two sides, the sense that by bridging over the highway we could make an immediate connection to the city and in a way link city and river in a way that had been impossible. And you can start to see how the idea on the St. Louis side of the river was very much about accommodating and reshaping the bluffs that had been there about 400 years ago. Beautiful, very dramatic limestone bluffs that had been sort of carved away to accommodate navigation. So those bluffs get reintroduced, next, and become islands when there's flooding. So the sort of sense of temporality becomes a sort of participant. Water becomes a participant in the shaping of an edge. Next. On the Cahokia side, or what used to be the Indian Cahokia side, East St. Louis, here the ground plane is much more horizontal, much flatter, and the sense of flooding can be increased in a way, and the temporality of water made much more prominent. Flooding is encouraged. This becomes a very different kind of setting where we really reintroduce the wetlands that had been there, that had been unfortunately drained about 80 years ago. And finally, the hope is that these two environments, both the urban and the natural, could be reconciled and become a kind of active participants around the dialogue of the river.
So this last project that we'll share tonight is the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle. And that is a case where you could say that all of the challenges that we've been so tantalized by, infrastructural, engineering, ecological, urban, were all at once at play in that competition. Go to the next slide. What's amazing about this particular site on the waterfront in Seattle was that it was never there before until Mr. Denny came along, and from the 30-year period that he decided to create new real estate. This is the Denny regrade, and he hosed down a bluff, and anybody who didn't sell out really didn't have a lot of choice after a while. But you can imagine that they acquired quite a lot of real estate on the waterfront by getting this bluff to become now landfill. And so you can see the middle road there, that 4-lane road used to be the water's edge. And when the Seattle Art Museum acquired this land, they announced a competition because they realized they didn't know what to do. 2 parcels with a highway between, and the city said that they could actually transform the waterfront, but that too was separated by Amtrak. And so they said, we want to do a competition. Artists, architects, landscape architects, anybody can compete. But we really want 3 parcels and a couple of artists doing great bridges, and we really want to have a great sculpture park. Next. They said, if we have enough money, we could cover up all the infrastructure like Millennium Park and have a great place too. So really we're posing these as scenarios, but our budget really is for the 3 parcels and the 2 bridges. So next, we said, well, what if you could actually maybe do both and maybe reveal the infrastructure in more exciting ways next? And consider maybe a new landscape that might begin at the city and wander to the water's edge, not covering up, but somehow revealing that infrastructure as part of the excitement. Next. And so it was one of these things where the kind of query of how do you do everything all at once, but not do all of it all at once, but something more primitive, if you will, something more fundamental, was this kind of infrastructural x-ray that led our thinking. Next. So we looked at this site and said, why not imagine a park that might wander from the city to the water's edge? Next. And in that way of wandering from the city to the water's edge, create a new topography that connects, links, and brings you to, in fact, not a hardened seawall, but maybe a softened beach with aquatic habitat. Next. So you can see we thought about it in layers, and these kinds of layers, if you will, have to do with contamination. We needed to remediate the fact that it used to be Union Oil of California. We had to figure out how to gather water, collect it, and use it for irrigation. Keep the water taxis, the trucks, all of the constraints all at once working. Next. And think about these layers in so many different ways, because in fact we had to keep a federally mandated 20-foot clearance for the highway. We needed 23-foot clearance for the train. We needed to get contamination wells that were accessible for review. The simultaneity, next, of all these things were things that had a big impact on what it took to realize this. And so when we won the competition, we thought that it would be a straight shot to the end, and this little timeline lets you know that everything from proposed freeway overpasses could stop your project at any moment. And it was really the vision of I would say the museum, the board, and the city together that got this strange chameleon section that nobody had ever seen realized. In fact, as you could see, the wishbone, if you will, over the highway had to apply for something called an aerial street vacation because they didn't know how else to permit this bridge. And so you can see this earthwork, if you will, in formation. And what we were so fortunate about was that the 40-foot grade change from the city to the water's edge worked in our favor to allow a smooth transition from the city down to the water. Next. But it really took the genius of, I would say, our engineers, who, when we proposed our beautiful poured-in-place concrete walls, and in the first budget, it turned out that those were double the entire budget, that we had to count on their brilliance at developing MSE, as we have now learned is mechanically stabilized earth, which is what you see for all the freeways and highways that need to do earthworks for supports. So this is what this is. And it brought the budget down so substantially that we had room to do the rest of the park. Next. But what was very interesting is that while we imagined big poured-in-place walls with their 42-inch, sort of clearance over the walkways would be very, very beautiful, it turned out they wouldn't have been so good. Seattle's seismically very active. So by being able to put precast panels that overlapped each other, that we could allow, in a sense, the kind of movement that a seismic event might create to not disturb the park. Next. And so it really was about deferring and submitting to the landscape. The Olympic Mountains across the way are why it's called the Olympic Sculpture Park, and you can see the Calder there. That's a first work of art that they acquired. Next. But it was really a profound place to allow other works of art, and this is Richard Serra's Wake, to be sort of embraced within a new valley that we created with the pavilion and descending terrace connecting itself back to the city, but retreating from the city at times. But that art program really was innovative. And what they were very visionary about was not having all the work selected to just place in the park, like a miniature golf course, but actually commission the art for this park. So you can see Michael will speak a little bit about Mark Dian's piece on the lower left, but this was really an adventure in the creation of a park and the creation of the art. Next. That creation, if you will, Richard Serra, you can imagine this from Long Island City, and flatbed trucks, high body, wide body, making their way through. Next. And you can see Richard Serra standing very proudly by his work as it's being installed, and you can imagine a collaboration with Richard Serra, which everybody warned us would be quite a challenge, was actually fabulous. The one point of insistence, though, was that originally this valley was planned to have numerous works of art, and he said they can go somewhere else. So you can see those valley walls and extending up the side were inventions that followed his recommendation to remove other arts from the center. And they now have linear galleries, which are actually quite fabulous. Next. And Roxy Payne with the stainless steel tree. We were so thrilled that that was commissioned and collected because indeed our building has a stainless steel perimeter as well. But if we go back just one slide, the building itself in many ways, this kind of unfolding diagram of the landscape is what inspired the pavilion unfolding itself. And it has the infrastructural job of having 60 cars parked below and the bridge itself linking to the edge of the city. Next. But it's one that can actually be a very tough space, not unlike this building. Just polished concrete floors, exposed structure. But amazing artworks are commissioned and changing in that, and they all look out to the water. But on the street side, the city side, there is more of an ephemeral cast, if you will, to the kind of wandering of that edge, tight against the edge. Next. And it's one where that stainless steel facade is alternately reflective, silver, white, or dark, but the view through the building from the city across to the water is one of our favorite aspects of this site. Next. And indeed, it's really all about building a topography, creating movement, slowing things down, the zigzag reversing your speed in the city, and creating something that might not be any other way except on this site.
If you could back up just a second, great. I think what we, and in a way it was a bit of serendipity, because I think sometimes you can never quite anticipate how certain projects turn out or certain aspects, but we love the idea that you can't quite tell where the building stops and the topography starts, or where the topography stops and the building starts. Next. And you could start to see that kind of trajectory, in a way, that kind of origami-like move starts to sort of unfold laterally, so that you can capture views both north, south, east, and west. So the pavilion sort of unfolds. The parking areas are actually places for dance performances and video performances. What we've discovered, in a way that I think often we underestimate, is the capacity for inhabitation in ways that are surprising and rather wonderful. So dance performances occur in places that we hadn't entirely anticipated. And in this case, Mark Dion, who's an artist very interested in the relationship between nature and culture, established a piece on Western Avenue, which is one of the major trucking routes. And the irony, of course, is that he proposed an enormous log in a place where major trucks carry logs from the Pacific Northwest. So this sense of nature and city in dialogue and in question is brought to the foreground with his piece. Next. And you can imagine when he proposed his sculpture, I think many trustees thought they were going to get something out of stone or steel. Instead, Mark proposed an 80-foot long nursing log with a lifespan of about 80 years. So I think the lesson here is that artists anticipate things that often sort of have yet to catch up. And the idea that art is permanent and fixed is certainly challenged in a piece like this that is very much temporal and about change. So the log now is host to about 100 different animals, insects, worms, different kind of creatures, and in a way completely reorients and causes us to rethink how culture and nature, art and artifice interact. And likewise, I think that kind of ambiguity is what we hope to achieve in this project. Here we are standing dead center over the highway. You have no sense that it's there. There's something kind of quiet. We wanted to not do a heroic bridge, but really let the kind of ground plane, the landscape, assert itself. Next. But underside becomes heroic. It becomes a place of great drama. Next. And that great drama is the sense that even someone not interested in art who might be driving by at 40 miles an hour would suddenly become an active participant. And the joke here was that if the museum installed a kind of a trip, they would somehow be able to advertise 40,000 visitors a month. You can do the math, over 1 million visitors a year. We don't know if they're doing that, but they certainly should. But likewise, the train tracks, which I think often are considered barriers, become for us and I think for the many of the artists an amazing opportunity. So here the sort of sense is that the trains become this kind of kinetic sculpture. They sort of slide through the landscape in surprising and unanticipated ways. And it's now become actually one of the most popular spots in the park. It's not as much about the sculpture or nature, but it's really about viewing the trains. And this particular piece we collaborated with the artist Teresita Fernandez, who did these kind of incredible glass panels that when seen become both object of sort of sculptural interest, but when looking out through, completely change the quality of light, including the reflected light. And this, I think, argues for the sort of serendipity of the kind of chance encounter, the chance material that works in ways that are both surprising and unexpected. Finally, the Z descends to a newly constructed waterfront. And here, well, I think we're particularly proud of the fact that some of the sort of most powerful architecture, most powerful engineering, most powerful kind of landscape moves are those which you don't see, those underwater. Next. And the sort of sense that this projects out over the water, we can catch the sort of the groundwater that descends from the park in this kind of swale. Again, it becomes clean enough that it can be discharged in Elliott Bay. Next. But it sort of helps create a new beach. This is a complete artifice, a completely engineered environment. The first place in Seattle where you can actually touch the water. And a little story is that we, as Marion mentioned, our lean budget, we probably were able to afford about 15 logs and fought for 15 logs. About a week later, they were installed, and an enormous storm came along and deposited this amazing debris, which we now take credit for. But again, I think the power of nature and the sense that I think one of our roles as designers is to submit to this power and perhaps harness and enjoy it. Next. So here you see the beach on a kind of quieter moment. Next. And then finally, again, what I mentioned, we were particularly proud of the fact that we were able to make a series of water terraces, aqueous terraces, where the structure of the landform slides under the water level and actually becomes a habitat for salmon. And being Seattle, salmon is not only rooted in the history of the place, but rooted also in the ecology of the region. So finally, it's about connecting city to site, the Olympic Mountains to the city to the Olympic Mountains. And perhaps could be described in a simple way. It's rather modestly, it's a park that wanders from the city to the water's edge.
So to close, what we wanted to do is share the fact that we never think that architecture has a clear beginning or an end. And as you saw through our drawings, we'll show a 2-minute, if you will, collage, literally and figuratively, of both the way we think about work, the way we make it, the way we postpone conclusions, and the way it joins the rest of the world. But it could be that I may just have closing words if the idiosyncratic technology decides to postpone the film.
We can start, yeah.
So 2 projects that you saw, the Diana Center and the Sculpture Park, are things that we decided to cast really both a retroactive manifesto with our sketches and iterations, but also cast it into the sense of movement, because ultimately architecture can never be represented properly just through photographs, but actually needs to come to life through the animation of time of day, and place. And so the kind of sense of motion that we could only first anticipate for ourselves through digital animations is something now that has become animated in new ways. And the kind of postponement of the hard edge of the charcoal drawing was something that led us to an architecture that had some softness in its interface with glass. And the ambition to literally break the boundaries of sectional layers and break the walls down and allow movement and connections to occur in new ways are things that are now actually taking place in ways, and you can imagine the architects are the only ones who've taken over the whole staircase. But the Seattle Sculpture Park then is again that whole query of the nervousness and uncertainty of how to do it all and how to give it measure, how to construct and build it, how to envision it in motion as part of the city, how to see it change maybe through a digital ambition, but then actually needs to go back to the charcoal drawings, back to the sectional perspective, back to the way we think about cutting those sections, and asking our engineers then how we might cut those sections again. So watch the red snake in the bottom of the drawing. And that kind of tapestry or panoramic convergence and sectional transformation was what we wanted in one simple line to be able to capture. But that line is never very fixed and very solid, but as Michael described, something that's ephemeral and changing. And in our own mind, as we sort of cast about with every media we have in sight when we're thinking about it, that somehow this thing needs to change. It needs to be changed by day and by night. Its structure needs to open up and offer new things, and the surfaces themselves need to suggest something that we may not have ever imagined. And so we hope with our closing that you can get a sense of our hunch that architecture is a vertical expression alone, as the sort of expression of public life, where interior and exterior are solidly separated, are no longer valid, but somehow this definition of architecture is something altogether different. So we're interested in a state of architecture, where architecture really is a medium for the continuous horizontal exchange between natural and artificial ecologies, internal and external activities, and new adventures yet to be born. Thank you.